This time in Puerto Rico, the Puerto Rican Independence Movement goes to an extreme crisis in falling because of the repression, and so many people were incarcerated. So that fear is maintained, that same fear that had been maintained since the invasion, since martial law was created, now another fear is created, you know, where parents and people do not talk about Puerto Rican, they fear Puerto Rican independence. Now another generation passes by, and now we start in the 1960s and 1970s. What's happening in the world? The Vietnam War is very big. Civil rights is very big. Against segregation is very big. Okay? So consciousness is being built. Okay? If you look in other countries, national liberation struggles are emerging. We have probably the most famous one in Africa, which is apartheid, where Nelson Mandela was the leader, and he was also incarcerated. And guess what his charge was? Do you guys know what his charge was? Seditious conspiracy. You know, Nelson Mandela was charged with seditious conspiracy because he was a leader of the one of the underground movements from the ANC, the African National Congress. So in 1960s, when everything is won, and in 1970s, then emerges a new generation of people who were fighting. We also at that particular time had the Black Panther Party, the Black Liberation Army also, that were doing the breakfast programs and also creating conscience for the black nation about what was going on with them because of the segregation that was continuing, and of course the lack of them being treated humanely, and all based on color. So in the 1970s, we see the emergence of the in the 60s, we see that because the Puerto Rican independence movement was repressed so much, and because it was very public and in their opposition to United States colonialism, a new phase of struggle starts developing. In Latin America is the urban guerrilla. I mean the rural guerrilla, where they have undergrounds. In United States happens the urban guerrilla, because of the repression that goes on and all the incarceration. Now everything goes underground, where people do not know who they are. Who are the people who are fighting for Puerto Rican independence? That's why you have the emergence of the Black Panther parties, and that's why you have the emergence of somebody group like the FAON, that the group that I was in was charged of being part of. That creates a situation for Puerto Rico, where in Puerto Rico there is a national liberation struggle, but now we have two forces. Not only are we in our nation fighting for Puerto Rican independence, but we are also in the land of the enemy fighting for our independence and creating a conscience and doing work in solidarity with other repressed groups. In 1970s, when I then go to high school, and of course, in my house there was always a Puerto Rican flag. And I know I was Puerto Rican, but I never knew what a Puerto Rican was. I never knew anything about Puerto Ricans. And if I were to ask my parents, my mother or anything who raised me, you know, she didn't know. Because first of all, she was the eldest, she was taken out of school. But in Puerto Rico, Puerto Rican history is not taught. If I asked the average Puerto Rican, and I was discussing this with some of the people that I was talking to, if I asked the average Puerto Rican, who is the father of our country, more than 90% will not be able to answer that question. But if I ask them, who is George Washington? You all know who George Washington is, right? What? No, I know you do. I know you do. George Washington, they will be able to answer that. That's an example of colonialism, because what colonialism does is rob you of your history, of your conscience, of who you are. And that's exactly what they have been doing to Puerto Rico. When your own country, you're not even taught your own history. When your own people in your own country cannot identify who's the father of that country, but then I ask them, who's George Washington, and they're able to answer that question very easily and thoroughly. So that's when you rob yourself, and that's where Puerto Ricans were at and still are today, because Puerto Rican history is still not taught in Puerto Rican high school, in schools today, except for one semester, which is just the natives, and then they jump to what's called Estado Libre Asociado. Now I enter in 1970s. I enter high school in September of 1970. You know, and one of the things that starts developing at that time is what's called a program that's called ASPIRA. And ASPIRA is a program, educational program, that was going to deal with Puerto Ricans, the education system, and to deal with higher education in order to maintain Puerto Ricans in high school. Why? Because Puerto Ricans in Chicago, the dropout rate for Puerto Ricans was 70 to 75%. When I went to high school in 1970, I started with over 1,200 students. When I graduated, only 400 graduated. 800 students had graduated, and the great majority, all of them, were Puerto Ricans who left. You know, that problem still exists today. The one that comes closest to us also is the African Americans. Today, 2015, 45% of African Americans do not graduate from high school. And for Puerto Ricans, it's now 60 to 65% do not graduate. So we do still have that major problem of education, and where do we go in the value of education. So in 70s, I then go into a high school, and then ASPIRA comes up, and I go and they have this seminar, and we start talking about Puerto Rican history. And then the idea comes up, why don't we have Puerto Rican studies? Why don't we have Latino studies? We unite with the African Americans for them to get African American history, because African Americans kids do not know their history neither. If I were to ask the average African American, name me a famous African American, not Martin Luther King, okay? Because I don't know. They will not be able to, the great majority of them. If I tell them what is the railroads, the secret railroads during the slave era, not all of them cannot tell me that neither. Again, a colonialized nation, they have, you know, you got to remember that the black nation in this country is the only one to go to shadow slaveryism, and that's very different. A lot of people like to argue that says that slavery existed in other places. Yes, they did, and I will grant you that. The only big difference is that in the other places, the family unit was kept together. The mother, the father, the children, and they all would move together. In the United States, that did not exist. The family unit were completely destroyed. They were taken, the parents, they were taken in one place, the kids were taken in another place, and they were never together. They were stripped of their names, they were stripped of their history, of their conscience. They were not allowed to get educated, and they were not allowed to be treated as human beings, not even to read. Nowhere else in the world has that happened but here in the United States. So we look in the 70s, and we also see that they need to know their history also. So we unite in a struggle for better education. And then we get Latino studies, and we get African American history in a high school in Chicago for the first time. So it is there that I start to learn that Puerto Rico has a glorious history, that we have famous men, famous women, that we have writers, composers, painters. I mean, a whole thing that I was just so interested that I knew that we had a history. Now I knew who I was as a Puerto Rican, you know, and that influenced me to continue my knowledge of who I am as a Puerto Rican. One of the things that we did, of course, is that we got the Latin American studies, and they brought a teacher in for the first time. This teacher was a student teacher, but a very brilliant student teacher, and he became the teacher of my history class, and he started teaching Puerto Rican history. That's when I learned all the things that I had just told you. I was amazed. So at the same time, we were fighting for better housing, better education, and also one of the things that has happened, and a lot of people, Latinos and blacks, take it for granted, is that at that time we could not go to universities. We could not go to high schools. I mean, colleges. You know, those doors were not open. And that's one of the first things that we did, was to make demonstrations, take over universities, take over chancellor's office, presidents, in order to get accessibility to our schools. We also did the community work and the housing. But the other thing that we did was education. And as I said, we opened the studies. I then started learning who I was as a Puerto Rican, and my teacher at that time asked me to do a paper on housing and the dilemma of housing in our community. Remember, Puerto Ricans are just moving in the 50s in mass migrations from 45 to 65. The biggest migration of Puerto Ricans happened, especially, and they come to New York, and the second place where most Puerto Ricans were living was in Chicago. That of course has changed now, but and we learned, and there is when I start working, and then I start working, and I'm assigned this task of doing a housing project, and the teacher tells me to go see this guy who's the head of the NCO, which is a neighborhood community organization that deals with housing. And so I was telling them about the little story that I had told them when I was told to go over there, and I saw the picture of the dude. He had this big old fat mustache and everything, you know. And so I went over there and talked, you know, to go see him, but he wasn't there. I go back to my teacher. I said, look, I went to go see that dude, and that Mexican wasn't there. You know, he burned me. He didn't go. I said, what Mexican? The guy that you told me? He goes, the professor tells me, no, he's not Mexican. I said, yes, he is. He looks like Zapata. And, you know, he's a big old fat mustache and everything. So he goes, no. And then he tells me, no, that happens to be my brother. And that person was, of course, the professor that I was on is Jose Lopez Rivera, and the person that he told me go see was Oscar Lopez Rivera. I was 14 and a half, 15 years old in 1971. So then I make this appointment with this guy again, you know, and I remember when Oscar sees me, you know, because Oscar has a hell of a sense of humor, you know, and I see him, he goes, hi, my name is Emilio Zapata. And I said, that's what his brother had told him already. And he laughed because he likes to do that, you know, he has a certain way of grinning himself. So I started working with Oscar Lopez Rivera at the age of about 15 and housing. And we continue. That was in 1972. In 1972, it's introduced to me the campaign to free the nationalist prisoners. The nationalist prisoners were the ones that I had just told you that were in 1950. There was Oscar Collazo, he had been there since 1950, and Lolita Lebron and everybody else, Irving Flores and Rafael Cancel Miranda. And I started then to join the campaign to free the nationalists. At that particular time when I joined, at that time it was about 73, 74, they already had like 18 years in prison, okay? And they were, of course, one of the longest political prisoners held in Puerto Rico at that time. The campaign goes fantastic, and in 1979, Puerto Rican independence, Carter gives them an executive clemency, and they're freed after 25 years in prison, and Oscar Collazo had 29 years in prison. It was a big victory. It is the first time in the history of Puerto Rico when they came out that there were no political prisoners in the jails of Puerto Rico. From 1936 to September of 1979, there always has been Puerto Rican political prisoners in prison in the United States. They were finally freed. Puerto Rico was in a very crucial time because of the movement and the national liberation struggles. There was a lot of action going on, a lot of clandestine work going on at that time, and one of the big stuff that we did was at that particular time was to seek the freedom of the nationalists, which we then got. We were able to achieve it in an international campaign and with the other things that had happened. So there was no political prisoners at that time, but that was very, very short-lived, because in 1980, April of 1980, 11 Puerto Ricans are incarcerated, 6 men and 5 women. And what do you think they're charged with? Seditious conspiracy. The overthrow of the United States government by force. That's exactly what it is. And seditious, and we're all charged with seditious conspiracy. Now, because we know that we're fighting a war of liberation against colonialism, and I told you that internationally colonialism is a crime, international law allows for nations who are colonialized, who are under colonial rule, to fight for Puerto independence against colonialism in any way they see necessary, including armed struggle. So we did not want to recognize the United States court system because they were trying us like any common criminals. So we invoked international law, and we said that we are freedom fighters against a colonial rule against the United States for the Puerto Rico being a colony of the United States. Of course, the United States would not accept it, and they were not going to recognize it, because if they recognize it, they will be in violation of international law. So we were charged with seditious conspiracy. And we refused to recognize the courts of the United States and refused to participate in the judicial system and in our trials. So the jury never saw us. They charged us. We never participated. The jury never saw us. The prosecution presented their case, and we were found guilty and given sentences from 55 to 105 years. In my particular case, they gave me a 98-year sentence, and I was supposed to come out in the year 2044. So we were incarcerated, and we went to prison. In 1981, the only one that didn't wind up in prison at that time was Lopez Rivera. And he was not captured in 1980. But unfortunately, 1 year later and 1 month later, Lopez Rivera was in this called Glenview, Illinois. And one of the things about Chicago, for those of you who don't know, is that Chicago is considered the most segregated city in the United States, and also the most racist major city in the United States at that time, and guess what, until today too. If you go to Chicago, you will see that Chicago is segregated. It don't matter how laws you pass, because the segregation law passed in 1956, Plessy versus Ferguson, where the United States declared that segregation is illegal and that you cannot segregate a population based on race and color. Unfortunately, in Chicago, that still happens, and it's still going on very much. So we went to prison, and then in 81, Oscar is in Glenview. He's not stopped because he had a violation or anything. He was stopped because he's a man of color. And the cops stopped him and asked him, "What are you doing here? Give me your IDs." And that's how Oscar gets captured, and the blunt racism that goes on in Chicago, in the Chicago area. So then the Puerto Ricans have been very fortunate because we've been able to free all the other nationals, but then of course they did not forget about us, and they created an international movement for liberation, for our liberation. And that continued on for years and years and years and years. But
how old were you when you went to prison?
I was 23 years old when I was my birthday. I was 23 years old when I went to prison. And with a 98-year sentence, which means that I wasn't going to come out ever in my life. But as a matter of fact, the judge, when he sentenced me, he said, "Mr. Jimenez, if I could, I would give you the death penalty without hesitation. But I can't. But I'm going to make sure you never come out of prison." And that's when he slammed the 98 years on me. And I said, "Well, you can give me 100, 200, 300, 500, but you're never going to stop the movement for the liberation of our country, of my country." So I take it, and that's it. And they gave Carmen the same sentence. So they developed an international campaign, but during that time we were repressed very much, and there's a lot of examples of all of us, but I want to concentrate more on Oscar's. One of the worst ones probably for me was that I lost my mother. My mother was very, very sick. She developed cancer at a very early age in her life. I knew she was going to die, and I asked to let me go to see her, and a bedside visit, and that we will pay for everything. the FBI came back. They went to the prison. They came back and they see me. They talked to me and said, "Look, your mother's dying. She is sick." I said, "Yeah, great news you did." I knew that already. And she said, "Well, let me tell you something. You're not gonna go to the funeral. You're not gonna go to the wake. You're not gonna let your sister get used to it. We're gonna give you a phone call and that's it. You know, and other than that, don't bother us no more. The decision has already been made." So they gave me a phone call on, I always remember the date, May 27th, 1990. And I talked to my mother, and she then said, you know, she said it in Spanish because I talked to her in Spanish. And says, you know, my son, I know I'm going to die. I'm never going to see you ever again, but know that I love you. I love you. And she went wild, and 10 days later she died. Worse was for Oscar Lopez Rivera. Oscar Lopez Rivera, after 1987, was accused, in 1986 was accused that he was going to leave prison early, and that he was in an escape. He was going to escape from prison. And then what they did was orchestrated a guy from FBI informant to say that he was going to do that. They then charged them with an escape, but I had told you that we don't recognize the courts of the United States, so we don't participate, even though he could have won the case easily because it wasn't. It was perpetrated by the FBI informant. He was found guilty and given another sentence, 15 more years to his 55 years, which is 70. But I say this because then he was assigned to Marion. And those of you who don't know about Marion is the most secure prison in the United States. It has no physical contact with nobody. Oscar was put in there where he had no physical contact with none of his visitors, including his mother and everybody else, all his family. And one of the things that his mother did get very, very sick during that time that he was there. She was able to see him, but she was never, ever again able to touch her son. She only saw him through a glass, a thick glass like that, and speaking to the phone.
And he was in solitary confinement for 12 years straight.
12 and a half years in Marion. Marion is a control unit. It's a deprivation system where they don't let you associate, have contact with nobody else except the guards. And when you have a visit through a thick glass about this fat, you know, and that's the only way. And his mother went to go see him, and I know his mother very, very well because I know the family for a long, long time. And she came back destroyed. She said, "They didn't let me touch my son. They didn't let me touch my son. I could not, you know." She never returned back, and she eventually died also. He never got to see her, never got to hold her, never got, you know. I was able to see my mother a couple times before she died. You know, like 3 or 4 years before she died, and I was able to see her. But that happened to a lot of the other prisoners. That happened to Matos. Also lost his mother. On her way to go see him in prison, she dies on the way to go see him. That's how, you know, the circumstances that we have been facing. So Oscar then stays in this place till he goes there in 1986, and he stays there 12 and a half years in isolation. But during that time, they take him out of Marion, and they put him in another brand new control unit that has never been used before. It's probably one of the most repressive units, and it's in Colorado. In Colorado, he is put in there, and he's the one who opens up the place. And so, and he stays there another few years until eventually the campaign to get him out of the control unit is successful. During those times, I was in what's called Lewisburg Penitentiary. Lewisburg Penitentiary is one of the most oldest and secure penitentiaries of the United States. And they also have a control unit, a semi-control unit there. And I was put in there because I was in another prison where they said that I wanted to leave early because they found evidence in my cell that I was preparing to leave, to escape. So they put me there like 24 hours later, and it's a unit where there's no windows in the cell at all. It's all bar open. There's a little passage. There's a window outside. It's got bars right in the front. It's got a window, bars in the back, and in front of it is a building of about four stories. And they kept me there for 12 and a half years. And in the time that I got out was because I was single-celled. I was always alone. And during that time, there was a big violence that occurred in the prison. The place where I was at controlled all the security people in the United States. You know, all the leaders of the Aryan Brotherhood, some black political prisoners, the leaders of all the gangs, Latinos and blacks and whites. Everybody was there in that unit because they needed to be watched. You know, and they were single cell. Unfortunately, in prison, white is privileged. You know, and just like it is here in this country, that white is privileged, they're privileged over there. And they get the better jobs and better housing and everything. And they actually were able to, the Aryan Brotherhood, to be able to move all in the same unit, but all together in one section, which is very, very rare. And they were allowed to do that, you know. And that is a little funny story I have because they actually, I know, knowing who I am and they knew who I was, they actually got along with me very, very much. And they respected me incredibly, you know. The person that was next to me was from the Aryan Brotherhood, and he was called a silent killer. He had killed already about 4 or 5 people in the penitentiary, and they put him right next to me. They moved the person that was there, and they put him there. And, you know, and he was a major problem. But eventually, you know, I won him. Was to the point that he respected me very, very much. And he actually told me, I said, man, you know, they brought me and they told me about you, but, you know, you're very different. He also knew Oscar, you know, because he was in Marion with Oscar. Okay? So they had a very big respect. When he found out that Oscar was my co-defendant, they had a whole different respect. So they move upstairs, and the guards had to move up there all together. They had one cell left. And they come down to me, the Aryan Brotherhood and Nazis and all that, and say, Ricardo, I say, how you doing? Hey, what's up? You know, they say, hey, you know, we want to ask you something. I said, we got one more cell left, and we were thinking if you want to move with us. I said, what the hell did you tell me? I said, no, we like you, you know nothing's going to happen to you, huh? I said, hell no. I said, no. I said, yeah, I know you know, and I don't want to use the word. I said, I know you're always with them. And, you know, I said, let me tell you something, all right? And I went to this whole historical thing of who is a Puerto Rican. And I said, you're telling me to hate myself because I have black blood, African blood in my system. And if you were to look at my mother, you would not say that to me, okay? And then I said, but I left, you know, I said, no, and it's okay. So one day they decide, they got high, they were drinking, right? And they decide, let's have a N night to kill. Let's have a kill N night. And they actually started from the top on the 3rd floor. And the first African American that they met, the first black that they met, they stabbed him and killed him. Then they kept going and killed and stabbing other people. I used to teach math. And so I'm going, somehow or another I was teaching, and I let my class out early, and I told them, everybody go home, I'm not going to, you know, and I don't know why I went, but then I went to I have 10 minutes to go and make a change from, if you were in the school and you want to go to your unit, you had 10 minutes to change, and, you know, and get ice and everything, so I went up there, got my ice, but before I went upstairs, I went and made a phone call, because the phones were, you know, usually they're very busy, and there was one open. So I have a phone call. So then I go up the stairs, and I'm in the 2nd floor. And when I'm coming down, I see all these Aryan Brotherhoods and Nazis all with bloody knives and everything. and they're looking at me. I said, I said, no, I went up, look, no, be the man that you guys are and just kill me right off the bat, you know? And he said, no, we're not going to kill you. I said, no. I said, go. I said, Ricardo, go to your cell and do not look back, you know, or else you're going to have a problem, you know? So I moved this way, and when I go here, there's a young brother, African-American brother, that's very good friends of mine. I say, hey, Ricardo, and we're starting talking. He started talking, and I'm trying to tell him, you know, I can't say because they're right there. And I said, man, and he's waiting to take a shower because somebody else is taking a shower. You know, there was the showers were full. Finally, somebody comes out of the shower. They go to their cell, but there's still somebody in there, and they go, oh, I see you, Ricardo, I got to go take a shower, you know. And then as soon as I leave, I go. They got this little guy, and I mean, they stabbed him. I mean, and I did turn around. I wasn't, you know, I did turn around. They actually killed him. You know, they stabbed him. They must have stabbed him about 20 times. You know, I tell you all this because then the warden then comes to me and said that he was going to put somebody in my cell and all this other stuff. And so I said, you're going to do what? I said, no, you're not. And I said, what are you going to do? I said, and I'm not going to use the words that I said, but, you know, I said, come here, MF, and, you know, and come in the cell and see what the hell I'm going to do to you, and see, and that'll give you your answer, you know. So he took me out of the cell, out of Lewisburg, but he did me kind of a favor because, and then he moved me in 48 hours because of the security. I wind up in Terre Haute, you know. Oscar, after 12 and a half years of being in the control unit and not seeing anybody, is also moved to Terre Haute. Now I know we cannot be together because there's a big line that says, do not let Oscar Lopez Rivera and Ricardo Jimenez be in the same prison, same unit, or nothing at all. We already knew that. So I told the lawyer, Jan, by the way, I told Jan, tell them to move me, leave Oscar here because he's very close to the family, and I hardly don't get any visits and stuff like that, so it doesn't matter. To our surprise, they let both of us out. Not only did they let both of us out, they put us in the same unit, you know, which was amazing, you know. That was very good for Oscar because at that time Oscar had not seen anybody. He had not touched anybody for 12 and a half years. He had not been with anybody in a prison, you know, that he knew, or he had not had any contact with anybody that loved him and cared for him. So that transition went very well because I was able to do that with him, and I was able to be with him and talk with him, and we had a lot of stuff to talk about. Then, of course, he was there doing We Have the campaign. The campaign then took a very big leap internationally, where the pressure was hold on Clinton to let us out. And so, and then in August of 1999, they organized a march in Puerto Rico, and over 100,000 people showed up to the march. And they know they have a major problem now with somebody, you know, a nation of 3.5, you know, has, plus the other demonstrations they had in Washington. And of course we had people in the legislature, there were, especially Luis Gutierrez was outstanding, you know. Of course I have to say that Louis and Oscar and myself and Carlos Alberto Torres were all old friends from way back from the university's times and stuff like that. And so they put him in there and they leave him there, and so we finally then they create the conditions where we start negotiating with the United States, to the point that it's never been done in the United States. They actually set a national conference call from California, Texas, to Terre Haute, to New York, in order for all of us to speak. They wanted to deal with the issue, and they actually had a conference call where all participated, you know, and we wanted to come to a consensus, you know, of what are we going to do, okay? And so after we discussed it and everything else, people signed and everything, but for me it was extremely hard. I could not do it And this was already where they gave us the final decision. Clinton said, if you don't sign by Friday, the offer is off. And so I went through a little thing with Oscar, of course, you know, because I mean, you're talking about somebody that I met at the age of 14 and a half, 15, who was probably my greatest mentor in my life, along with Carmen Valentin, who was also in prison. And so at that time was when he decided, look, you've made sacrifices before, you're going to make this one, and you're leaving. So, and so on September 8th, I signed the papers, and then everybody's then is released on September 10th. All right? And, you know, so that's a basic synopsis. If you have any questions, whatever, we can, you know.
Well, for time, what I'm going to do is